Farmer Giles of Ham by J.R.R. Tolkien. Foreword. Of the history of the little kingdom, few fragments have survived, but by chance an account of its origin has been preserved. A legend, perhaps, rather than an account, for it is evidently a late compilation full of marvels derived not from sober annals, but from the popular lays to which its author frequently refers. For him the events that he records lay already in a distant past, but he seems, none the less, to have lived himself in the lands of a little kingdom. Such geographical knowledge as he shows is of that country, while of regions outside it, north or west, he is plainly ignorant. An excuse for presenting a translation of this curious tale out of its very insular Latin into the modern tongue of the United Kingdom may be found in a glimpse that it affords of life in the dark period of the history of Britain, not to mention the light that it throws on the origin of some difficult place names. Some may find the character adventures of its hero attractive in themselves. The boundaries of the little kingdom, either in time or space, are not easy to determine from the scanty evidence. Since Brutus came to Britain, many kings and realms have come and gone. The partition under Lochrin, Camber, and Albanac was only the first of many shifting divisions, what with the love of petty independence on the one hand, and on the other hand the greed of kings for wider realms. The years were filled with swift alternations of war and peace, of mirth and woe, as historians of the reign of Arthur tell us, a time of unsettled frontiers, when men might rise or fall suddenly, and songwriters had abundant material and eager audiences. Somewhere in those long years, after the days of King Cole maybe, but before Arthur or the 7 kingdoms of the English, we must place the events here related, and their scene is the valley of the Thames, with an excursion northwest to the walls of Wales. The capital of the little kingdom was evidently, as is ours, in its south-east corner, but its confines are vague. It seems never to have reached far up the Thames into the west, nor beyond Otmore to the north. Its eastern borders are dubious. There are indications in a fragmentary legend of Georgius, son of Giles, and his page Pulvitaulius Sweat, that at one time an outpost against the Middle Kingdom was maintained at Farthingo. But that situation does not concern this story, which is now presented without alteration or further comment, though the original grandiose title has been suitably reduced to Farmer Giles of Ham. Farmer Giles of Ham, Aegidius de Hamo, was a man who lived in the midmost parts of the island of Britain. In full his name was Aegidius Ahenobarbarus Julius Agricola de Hamo. For people were richly endowed with names in those days, now long ago, when this island was still happily divided into many kingdoms. There was more time then, and folk were fewer, so that most men were distinguished. However, those days are now over. So I will, in what follows, give the man his name shortly and in the vulgar form. He was Farmer Giles of Ham, and he had a red beard. Ham was only a village, but villages were proud and independent still in those days. Farmer Giles had a dog. The dog's name was Garm. Dogs had to be content with short names in the vernacular. The book Latin was reserved for the betters. Garm could not talk even dog Latin, but he could use the vulgar tongue, as could most dogs of his day, either to bully, or to brag, or to wheedle in. Bullying was for beggars and trespassers, bragging for other dogs, and wheedling for his master. Garm was both proud and afraid of Giles, who could bully and brag better than he could. The time was not one of hurry or bustle, but bustle has very little to do with business. Men did their work without it, and they got through a deal both of work and of talk. There was plenty to talk about, for memorable events occurred very frequently. But at the moment when this tale begins, nothing memorable had, in fact, happened in Ham for quite a long time. which suited Farmer Giles down to the ground. He was a slow sort of fellow, rather set in his ways, and taken up with his own affairs. He had his hands full, he said, keeping the wolf from the door, that is, keeping himself as fat and comfortable as his father before him. The dog was busy helping him. Neither of them gave much thought to the wide world outside their field, the village, and the nearest market. But the wide world was there. The forest was not far off, and away west and north were the wild hills, and the dubious marches of the mountain country. And among other things still at large there were giants, rude and uncultured folk, and troublesome at times. There was one giant in particular, larger and more stupid than his fellows. I find no mention of his name in the histories, but it does not matter. He was very large. His walking stick was like a tree, and his tread was heavy. He brushed elms aside like tall grasses, and he was the ruin of roads and the desolation of gardens, for his great feet made holes in them as deep as wells. If he stumbled into a house, that was the end of it. And all this damage he did wherever he went, for his head was above the roofs of houses, and left his feet to look after themselves. He was near-sighted, and also rather deaf. Fortunately, he lived far off in the wild, and seldom visited the lands inhabited by men, at least not on purpose. He had a great tumble-down house away up in the mountains, but he had very few friends, owing to his deafness and his stupidity, and scarcity of giants. He used to go out walking in the wild hills, in the empty regions of the feet of the mountains, all by himself. One fine summer's day this giant went out for a walk, and wandered aimlessly along, doing a great deal of damage in the woods. Suddenly he noticed that the sun was setting, and felt his supper time was drawing near. But he discovered that he was in a part of the country that he did not know at all, and had lost all his way. Making a wrong guess at the right decision, he walked and he walked until it was dark night. Then he sat down and waited for the moon to rise. Then he walked and walked in the moonlight, striding out with a will, for he was anxious to get home. He had left his best copper pot on the fire, and feared that the bottom would be burned. But his back was to the mountains, and he was already in the lands inhabited by men. He was indeed now drawing near to the farm of Aegidius Ahenobarbus Julius Agricola, and the village called, in the vulgar tongue, Ham. It was a fine night. The cows were in the field, and Farmer Giles' dog had gone out and gone for a walk on his own account. He had a fancy for moonshine and rabbits. He had no idea, of course, that a giant was also out for a walk. That would have given him a good reason for going out without leave, but a still better reason for staying quiet in the kitchen. At about 2 o'clock the giant arrived in Farmer Giles's fields, broke the hedges, trampled on the crops, and flattened the mowing grass. In 5 minutes he had done more damage than the royal fox hunt could have done in 5 days. Garm heard a thump coming along the river bank, and he ran to the west side of a low hill on which the farmhouse stood, just to see what was happening. Suddenly he saw the giant stride across the river and tread upon Galathea, the farmer's favourite cow, squashing the poor beast as flat as the farmer could have squashed a black beetle. That was more than enough for Garm. He gave a yelp of fright and bolted home, quite forgetting that he was out without leave. He came and barked and yammered underneath his master's bedroom window. There was no answer for a long time. Farmer Giles was not easily wakened. "Help! Help! Help!" cried Garm. The window opened suddenly, and a well-aimed bottle came flying out. "Ow!" said the dog, jumping aside with practised skill. "Help! Help! Help!" Out popped the farmer's head. "Drat you, dog! What be you a-doing?" said he.
"Nothing,"
said the dog. "I'll give you nothing. I'll flay the skin off you in the morning," said the farmer, slamming the window.
"Help! Help! Help!"
cried the dog. Out came Giles's head again. "I'll kill you if you make another sound," he said. "What's come to you, you fool?"
"Nothing,"
said the dog.
"but something's come to you."
"What do you mean?" said Giles, startled in the midst of his rage. Never before had Garm answered him saucily.
"There's a giant in your fields, an enormous giant, and he's coming this way,"
said the dog.
"Help! Help! He is trampling on your sheep. He has trampled on poor Galathea, and she's as flat as a doormat. Help! Help! He's burstling all your hedges, and he's crushing all your crops. You must be bold and quick, master, or you will soon have nothing left. Help!"
Garm began to howl. "Shut up!" said the farmer, and he shut the window. "Lord a mercy!" he said to himself, and though the night was warm, he shivered and shook.
"Get back to bed and don't be a fool,"
said his wife,
"and drown that dog in the morning. There is no call to believe what a dog says. They'll tell any tale when caught truant or thieving."
"Maybe, Agatha," said he,
"And maybe not, but there's something going on in me fields, or Garm's a rabbit. That dog was frightened, and why should he come yammering in the night when he could sneak in at the back door with the milk in the morning?" "Don't stand there arguing," said she. "If you believe a dog, then take his advice. Be bold and quick."
"Easier said than done," answered Giles, for indeed he believed quite half of Garm's tale. In the small hours of the night giants seemed less unlikely. Still, property is property, and Farmer Giles had a short way with trespassers that few could outface. So he pulled on his breeches and went down into the kitchen and took his blunderbuss from the wall. Some may well ask what a blunderbuss was. Indeed, this very question, it is said, was put to the 4 wise clerks of Oxenford, and after thought they replied, "A blunderbuss is a short gun with a large bore, firing many balls or slugs, and capable of doing execution within a limited range without exact aim." Now suspended in civilized countries by other firearms. However, Farmer Giles's blunderbuss had a wide mouth that opened like a horn, and it did not fire balls or slugs, but anything that he could spare to stuff in, and it did not do execution, because he seldom loaded it and never let it off. The sight of it was usually enough for his purpose. And this country was not yet civilized, for the blunderbuss was not superseded. It was indeed the only kind of gun that there was, and rare at that. People preferred bows and arrows, and used gunpowder mostly for fireworks. Well then, Farmer Giles took down the blunderbuss, and he put in a good charge of powder, just in case extreme measures should be required, and into the wide mouth he stuffed old nails and bits of wire, pieces of broken pot, bones and stones and other rubbish. Then he drew on his top boots and his overcoat, and he went out through the kitchen garden. The moon was low behind him, and he could see nothing worse than the long black shadows of bushes and trees, but he could hear a dreadful stumping coming up the side of the hill. He did not feel either bold or quick, whatever Agatha might say, but he was more anxious about his property than his skin. So, feeling a bit loose about the belt, he walked towards the brow of the hill. Suddenly, up over the edge of it, the giant's face appeared, pale in the moonlight, which glittered in his large round eyes. His feet were still far below,
making holes in the fields. The moon dazzled the giant, and he did not see the farmer, but Farmer Giles saw him and was scared out of his wits. He pulled the trigger without thinking, and the blunderbuss went off with a staggering bang. By luck it was pointed more or less at the giant's large, ugly face. Out flew the rubbish, and the stones, and the bones, and bits of crock and wire, and half a dozen nails. And since the range was indeed limited, by chance and no choice of the farmer's many of these things struck the giant. A piece of pot went in his eye, and a large nail stuck in his nose. "Blast!" said the giant in his vulgar fashion. "I'm stung!" The noise had made no impression on him. He was rather deaf, but he did not like the nail. It was a long time since he had met any insect fierce enough to pierce his thick skin, but he had heard tell that away east in the fens there were dragonflies that could bite like hot pincers. He thought that he must have run into something of the kind. "Nasty, unhealthy parts, evidently," said he. "I shan't go any further this way tonight." So he picked up a couple of sheep off the hillside to eat when he got home, and went back over the river, making off about northwest at a great pace. He found his way home again in the end, for he was at last going in the right direction, but the bottom was burned off his copper pot. As for Farmer Giles, when the blunderbuss went off, it knocked him flat on his back, and there he lay looking at the sky and wondering if the giant's feet would miss him as they passed by. But nothing happened, and the stomping died away in the distance. So he got up, rubbed his shoulder, and picked up the blunderbuss. Then suddenly he heard the sound of people cheering. Most of the people of Ham had been looking out of their windows. A few put on their clothes, and some came out, after the giant had gone away. Some were now running up the hill shouting. The villagers had heard the horrible thump thump of the giant's feet, and most of them had immediately got under the bedclothes. Some had got under the beds, but Garm was both proud and frightened of his master. He thought him terrible and splendid when he was angry, and he naturally thought that any giant would think the same. So as soon as he saw Giles come out with the blunderbuss, a sign of great wrath as a rule, he rushed off to the village, barking and crying, "Come out! Come out! Come out! Get up! Get up! Come and see my great master! He is bold and quick! He is going to shoot a giant for trespassing! Come out!" The top of the hill could be seen from most of the houses. When the people and the dogs saw the giant's face rise above it, they quailed and held their breath, and all but the dog among them thought that this would prove a matter too big for Giles to deal with. Then the blunderbuss went bang, and the giant turned suddenly and went away, and in their amazement and their joy they clapped and cheered, and Garm nearly barked his head off. "Hooray!" they shouted. "That will learn him! Master Agadius has given him what for. Now he will go home and die, and serve him right and proper." Then they all cheered him again together. But even as they cheered, they took note for their own profit after all this blunderbuss could really be fired. There had been some debate in the village inns on the point, but now the matter was settled. Farmer Giles had little trouble with trespassers after that. When all seemed safe, some of the bolder folk came right up the hill and shook hands with Farmer Giles. A few, the parson and the blacksmith and the miller, and one or two other persons of importance, slapped him on the back. That did not please him. His shoulder was very sore, but he felt obliged to invite them into his house. They sat round in the kitchen, drinking his health and loudly praising him. He made no effort to hide his yawns, but as long as the drink lasted, they took no notice. By the time they had all had one or two, and the farmer 2 or 3, he began to feel quite bold. When they had all had 2 or 3, and he himself 5 or 6, he felt as bold as his dog thought him. They parted good friends, and he slapped their backs heartily. His hands were large, red, and thick, so he had his revenge. Next day he found that the news had grown in the telling, and he had become an important local figure. By the middle of the next week the news had spread to all the villages within 20 miles. He had become the hero of the countryside. Very pleasant he found it. Next market day he got enough free drink to float a boat. That is to say, he nearly had his fill, and came home singing old heroic songs. At last even the king got to hear of it. The capital of that realm, the Middle Kingdom of the island in those happy days, was some 20 leagues distant from Ham, and they paid little heed at court, as a rule, to the doings of rustics in the provinces. But so prompt an expulsion of a giant so injurious seemed worthy of note and of some little courtesy. So in due course, that is, in about 3 months, and on the feast of St. Michael, the king sent a magnificent letter. It was written in red upon white parchment, and expressed the royal approbation of our loyal subject and well-beloved Agdius Ahenobarbus Julius Agricola de Hamo. The letter was signed with a red blot, but the court scribe had added, Ego Augustus Conifucius, Ambrosius Aurelianus, Anthonius Pius et Magnificus, and a large red seal was attached. The document was plainly genuine. It afforded great pleasure to Giles, and was much admired, especially when it was discovered that one could get a seat and a drink by the farmer's fire by asking to look at it. Better than the testimonial was the accompanying gift. The king sent a belt and a large sword. To tell the truth, the king had never used the sword himself. It belonged to the family, and had been hanging in his armoury time out of mind. The armourer could not say how it came there, or what might be the use of it. Plain heavy swords of that kind were out of fashion at court just then, so the king thought it was the very thing for a present to a rustic. But Farmer Giles was delighted, and his local reputation became enormous. Giles much enjoyed the turn of events. So did his dog. He never got his promised whipping. Giles was just a man according to his lights. In his heart he gave a fair share of credit to Garm, though he never went so far as to mention it. He continued to throw hard words and hard things at the dog when he felt inclined. But he winked at many little outings. Garm took to walking far afield. The farmer went about with a high step, and Lux smiled on him. The autumn and early winter work went well. All seemed set fair, until the dragon came. In those days, dragons were already getting scarce in the island. None had been seen in the midland realm of Augustus Bonifacius for many a year. There were, of course, the dubious marches and the uninhabited mountains, westward and northward, but they were a long way off. In those parts once upon a time there had dwelt a number of dragons of one kind and another, and they had made raids far and wide. But the Middle Kingdom was in those days famous for the daring of the king's knights, and so many stray dragons had been killed or had returned with grave damage that the others gave up going that way. It was still the custom for dragon's tail to be served up at the king's Christmas feast, and each year a knight was chosen for the duty of hunting. He was supposed to set out upon St. Nicholas's Day, and come home with a dragon's tail not later than the eve of the feast. But for many years now the royal cook had made a marvellous confection, a mock dragon's tail of cake and almond paste, with cunning scales of hard icing sugar. The chosen knight then carried this into the hall on Christmas Eve, while the fiddles played and the trumpets rang. The mock dragon's tail was eaten after dinner on Christmas Day, and everybody said, to please the cook, that it tasted much better than the real tail. That was the situation when a real dragon turned up again. The giant was largely to blame. After his adventure, he used to go about in the mountains visiting his scattered relations more than had been his custom, and much more than they liked, for he was always trying to borrow a large copper pot. But whether he got the loan of one or not, he would sit and talk in his long-winded lumbering fashion about the excellent country down away east, and all the wonders of the wide world. He had got it into his head that he was a great and daring traveller. "A nice land," he would say, "pretty flat, soft to the feet, and plenty to eat for the taking. Cows, you know, and sheep all over the place, easy to spot if you look carefully. But what about the people? I never saw any," said he. "There was not a night to be seen or heard, my dear fellows, nothing worse than a few stinging flies by the river." "Why don't you go back and stay there?" said they. "Oh, well, there's no place like home, they say," said he. "But maybe I shall go back one day when I have a mind. And anyway, I went there once, which is more than most folk can say. Now, about that copper pot." "And these rich lands?" they would hurriedly ask. "These delectable regions full of undefended cattle, which way do they lie, and how far off?" "Oh," he would answer, "away east or south-east, but it's a long journey." And then he would give such an exaggerated account of the distance that he had walked, and the woods, hills, and plains that he had crossed, but none of the other less long-legged giants ever set out. Still, the talk got about. Then the warm summer was followed by a hard winter. It was bitter cold in the mountains, and food was scarce. The talk got louder. Lowland sheep and kine from the deep pastures were much discussed. The dragons pricked up their ears. They were hungry, and these rumours were unattractive. "So, knights are mythical," said the younger and less experienced dragons. "We always thought so." "At least they may be getting rare," thought the older and wiser worms. "Far and few, and no longer to be feared." There was one dragon who was deeply moved. Chrysophlix was his name, for he was of ancient and imperial lineage, and very rich. He was cunning, inquisitive, greedy, well armoured, but not over bold. But at any rate, he was not in the least afraid of flies or insects of any sort or size, and he was mortally hungry. So one winter's day, about a week before Christmas, Chrysophlix spread his wings and took off. He landed quietly in the middle of the night, plump in the heart and in the midland region of Augustus Bonifacius Rex et Basilius. He did a deal of damage in a short time, smashing and burning and devouring sheep, cattle, and horses. This was in a part of the land a long way from Ham, but Garm got the fright of his life. He had gone off on a long expedition, and taking advantage of his master's favour, he had ventured to spend a night or two away from home. He was following an engaging scent along the eaves of a wood, when he turned a corner and came suddenly upon a new, alarming smell. He ran indeed slap into the tail of Chrysophlix, who had just landed. Never did a dog turn his own tail round and bolt home swifter than Garm.